Welcome to Attachment Matters, a series of conversations between two moms who love to nerd out on the subject of attachment. We'll dive into what it is, what it isn't, what it relates to, what it can mean for parenting, and how it can help us explain the current state of things. Rose was introduced to Dr. Gordon Neufeld's attachment-based developmental model when her two sons were very young, and it has significantly shaped her life. She brings a depth of knowledge from the work of Dr. Gordon Neufeld, having taken a number of courses at the Neufeld Institute. This series offers her the opportunity to share insights from this model with parents who are trying to make sense of their trans-identified children.
As a mom of two teens and a former classroom educator, Stoic Mom has an intense interest in attachment and development. She's done some serious dabbling into the Neufeld bank of knowledge, but also has a knack for scanning the environment for frameworks to discover where they overlap and where they diverge. In her work supporting parents of trans-identified kids, she's committed to making sense of how we find ourselves grappling with things like gender identity and the other ways that our kids are struggling to find their place in this world. Both of us found ourselves entangled in the world of gender ideology, following very different routes to get here. We share a passion for the attachment framework as a way to understand and fulfill our roles and responsibilities as mothers in these oh-so-strange times.
In this episode, we talk about how we got here, both in conversation together and in our stories with this material. We also begin to talk about how attachment factors into the larger picture of how we all got here. Yeah, well, let's dive in.
Okay.
With me today is Rose, and people may know Rose from a couple of media appearances. Initially, it was True Believer, which was a pretty controversial pet article. And then you've also been featured in a couple of interviews, one on trigonometry, which has a very large audience, and then Gender a Wider Lens. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you, Stoic Mom. It's an honor to be here.
And you and I were connected through a mutual friend. And I was so excited to get to meet you. I think that you were brought into this gender world through a very different route than many of my listeners. And I was so appreciative when I read True Believer, because I think it's so important that we make sense of what's going on, and so I think the more varied stories we have, the better. And when you and I did connect, it was over a passion for attachment theory, specifically the Neufeld approach to attachment, right? And so, yeah. So we decided to do a series of podcast episodes. And that's what this is episode number 1 of, whatever we decide to call it.
Yay.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. And so I'm going to invite you to tell your story. And I appreciate, what we've decided to do here as an opportunity to also tell a little bit more of mine, Clearly, we all come into this with background and baggage and lots of life events that led us here. And clearly, we all have complex stories. And so yeah, I think this is going to be really good, and I'm excited to dive in with you. Do you mind going first? Kind of.
Sure. So thank you so much, Stoic Mom. Like I said, it's truly an honor to be here, and for those of you who are listening, I welcome anybody who's interested, who has not already kind of read any of my pieces or listened to my interviews, to do so. But in summary, I am a former affirming parent. I am a former affirming mom. I was very ideologically captured, very, very deep within social justice movements for about 20 years. Um, and so I kind of almost have an interesting perspective in many ways into this societal phenomenon
Mhm.
in that, I feel like I've probably been on the inside of what maybe many of your listeners, children or young adult children, are experiencing. But I've come out of it, which gives me kind of a very unique perspective.
Okay.
So, anyways, I thought my son was transgender at a very young age, and fortunately, this Neufeld approach is part of what helped my partner and I gain enough insight to realize we had made a mistake and to, as I've said in some past interviews, realize that, I was the one leading him into a cross-sex identity, and therefore I had the responsibility to lead him out. So that's in a nutshell, the story that I've written about and done interviews about. And in terms of this series, you spoke to us meeting. I had, really been sort of following a lot of the parent conversation, reading the PIT blog and listening to Gender a Wider Lens podcast for a little over a year before I published True Believer. And so I had heard about you, I'd seen you, I had uh, maybe even listened to a couple of your podcasts or read some of your Substack, and I heard your Gender Wider Lens interview. So when we were connected through a mutual friend, I was also very excited to connect with you. And oh, this is what it was. On True Believer, you posted a comment.
Mm.
And I'm glad we're talking about this. Because publishing that story was very, as you can imagine, a super intense. It was incredibly vulnerable, probably the most vulnerable thing I've ever had to do in my life. And I was publishing on a forum of people who weren't captured, but I was coming from a community where all of my relationships are and were.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
therefore, there was just a lot of, I would say, responses to the story that
Mhm.
varied.
Mhm. Mhm.
Some very compassionate, others outraged.
Mhm.
And your post on that story, your comment, speaking to what you could see that I had to go through to
Mhm.
come out of the belief system, was so insightful and so compassionate. I was deeply moved by it. So I just want to thank you. I've never thanked you for that. I want to thank
Mm.
you for what you said and what you wrote. And so when we were eventually able to connect, it was just such a gift because you had given me such a gift with what you wrote in
Mm.
response to my piece.
Well, you had really given the world a gift by being able to bring that perspective, and that I can't imagine the courage that that took to write that piece and put that out there, and the vulnerability, as you mentioned. Like,
Mhm.
thank you for being willing to tell that story,
Yeah, yeah,
and I think it is again through those stories that we are able to make sense of where we find ourselves. So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It gave me so much more insight into my own experience
Mm.
to put it
Mm.
out there in writing to the world and get that feedback from others too on it, so that it really helped my healing process.
It's interesting too, like in thinking about the responses and the comments. I think it was such an illustration, and this is not the intended direction of this particular series, but it is where we find ourselves, right? Is like that was a little snapshot, a
Yep.
little sort of um what's the word I'm looking for? It kind of captures where we are, the divisiveness, that tendency to other, to vilify the other side and kind of come from this righteous place, which I find very concerning. I don't know that that gets us where we really want to go. So,
Yeah.
and that is, for me, that is the inspiration for this series, is because
Mm.
that was my attraction to Or I guess it's my continued attraction to attachment. I've moved a little bit away from what it means as far as parenting is concerned, but I'm excited to dive into that with you.
Mhm.
But what continues to excite me about attachment theory and what that means for us developmentally is I think it gives us some insight into what made us vulnerable to this ideology, and what makes our children vulnerable to this
Yeah.
ideology. And kind of, I think attachment really factors into where we find ourselves, in this point in time and and how we feel about each other and how we respond to difficult circumstances and right like it's all of that attachment plays into all of that. And so for me it's about bringing more understanding and making sense of how we got here so that when we're rebuilding, when we're, when we're deciding what direction humanity is going to go in, we can do it with intention and more understanding and compassion. So,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And in some of our some of our conversations leading up to starting this together, I spoke to, and you'll hear this in my stories as I share them. If you didn't already see this about me, I was and I still, have these impulses where I want to help, I want to
Mm-hmm.
see the world. I just, I have these, just that you could call it by a lot of different names, idealism or
Mm-hmm.
that alpha caring drive, if we're gonna, be diving into this Neufeld model and some of these concepts to try to fix things, try to take care of others. And so um, a lot of my journey with the Neufeld material has, when I've learned, it's helped me so much, and it plays such a key role in my story of getting out of the ideological capture around gender ideology and what I was going through with my family. And so I've always kind of, had this like zealotry,
Mm-hmm.
proselytizing, and in this, I just want to just say this openly and vulnerably, like as we begin this conversation together, that I'm aware of that in me. And my hope and my intention is really to bring what I have to share around these insights with, and as an act of service. So really just offering up what I can in hopes that it may be of service to others. I know it is going to help me to have these conversations and try to articulate these ideas and share some of my story. But that is my what I hope my approach is to talking with you and sharing this podcast is just to offer what I can in service and know that for some people it may not land at all. It may not help at all, but I am going to do what I can to just offer what I have and hope that there will be pieces that resonate with your audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. As you're saying this, it's also it's bringing up for me the the challenge that it was to read Hold On to Your Kids.
Mm. Whew.
So, yeah. Yeah, which was a book recommended. I came across that book. It wasn't certainly not my first exposure to attachment. My initial interest in attachment happened long before reading that book. Um, and you and I know, Neufeld has his own unique ideas and approach to attachment that are a little bit more maybe developed than some of the other stuff that's out there.
Mhm.
Um, but that book was very challenging. And I think, especially for parents of teenagers and older teenagers and adult children, where you kind of there's a lot of guilt involved as you're reading and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I did it all wrong.
Yeah.
And that can be really challenging. It can be a really challenging read. And the really helpful stuff for moms who are on the other side of parenting small children comes toward the end of the book, where there are
Mm.
some suggestions for how to heal the relationship,
Mhm.
and to strengthen the relationship and to strengthen those bonds and the importance of that. But yes, it can be challenging to get through to that part for moms of older children. And so you have two boys, is that
Yep.
right?
Yep, and they have not hit adolescence yet. So
Can I ask their ages just so we've got a little context for
10 and 8.
10 and 8? Okay. 10
Mhm.
and 8. Yeah.
But what you raise about hold on to your kids, I think that's a good jumping off point for me just to kind of tell my Neufeld story. How did I um how did I find hold on to your kids? How did I find this approach? And so I'd love to just kind of start there. So when I was pregnant with our older son, who's now 10, I got really into like home birth and attachment, parenting, and that was a lot of like the community we were surrounded by. And so once my son was born and we were in the thick of that baby time, a lot of stuff came up around sleep. Like what an issue for mothers, in our cultures. What are the best practices around sleep? And so I had this huge tension going on inside of me around, if I co-sleep, am I going to ruin my child's life? If I sleep train, am I going to ruin my child's life? I was struggling with those questions and just in this kind of, and I think some of this story actually might resonate with what parents go through around other themes as well. But it was just this intense churning, churning of wanting to get it right. And just in what we will talk about more in this series, this pursuit. I was in pursuit of the right answer. Okay. So
It
I
feels so
was,
high stakes, right?
oh
Yeah,
my
every
goodness.
choice is so high stakes.
So I was on the blogs. I was
Hmm.
on and I just constant pursuit of information of trying to just close that gap, get it right.
Hmm. Hmm.
So one day I was in that pursuit mode. I was working full, almost full time. I was pumping at work.
Hmm.
And I'm on the mom blog and I'm in the comment of the mom blog and then I'm in the response to the comment and then the response to the response to the response to the comment. I am in the rabbit hole. Okay.
Hmm.
Deep in the rabbit hole. And this one little comment says, if you are reading Dr. Sears, and for those in your audience who are familiar with Dr. Sears, the whole attachment, baby bonding, that whole kind of, those books. And if you're into attachment, you're reading Dr. Sears, you don't know attachment, read Neufeld and Cohn, Alfie Cohn.
Alfie Kohn.
Um, I already knew Alfie Cohn. I knew Punished by Rewards. I hadn't read him, but I had a familiarity because of my own kind of professional background.
Hmm.
And so I was like, oh, I know Cohn. Well, who's this Neufeld guy?
Hmm.
So I started to look him up online. I started to read a little bit online. Over time, eventually it brought me to Hold On to Your Kids. So I ordered the book and here I am. I have a baby, right? So I don't have an older child. I don't even have a toddler at this point. But somehow I get the book. And I start to let these ideas percolate. I don't even really remember what I was actually getting from them at this point because nothing was real to me yet.
Hmm.
At that
Except
point,
for the drive to do it right.
yeah, well, which I didn't even have an awareness of. I can look back and name it,
Hmm.
but I wasn't aware of it at that time. I was just in it. It was just happening to me.
Hmm.
And so I end up with the book. And then when my second son is born, and my older son is now, two-ish, I've got a, now 3-month old, let's say. I finally read the book because I have time. My 2-year-old's napping sometimes. I'm
Right.
holding the 3-month old in the recliner and I start reading Hold On to Your Kids. And I loved the book. But the
Hmm.
interesting thing is that I didn't have an immediate application yet, for my own children, but I did have a projection I could put it on.
Okay.
which was my wife's younger sister, who was an adolescent and
Uh-huh.
whose life was falling to pieces.
Okay.
Just a dumpster fire. Okay.
Hmm.
And I could see everything her parents were doing wrong. And I thought I could save her. And we had a
Mm,
tradition where she would come and stay with us for a week every summer. She's way younger, like 20 years younger than my partner.
mhm,
Um, and she was coming to visit. And so I knew enough to be dangerous. I, could see the peer orientation. I could see this drive. Her aunt, she, was on her phone. She was online. She was, had been doing cutting behavior. She had ended up
mhm,
in the ER a couple times. And here we are with a baby and a 2-year-old, and like she comes from across the country to stay with us.
mm,
And I think I'm going to help her with my new knowledge. And
mm,
um, I did the thing that I think many parents do. Um, I, you know, she was engaging in some high risk behavior with the online, you know, kind of activity, and I took her phone away.
mm, mhm,
And trust me, within minutes, it was time to get her dad. She called her dad, and he drove across the country to pick her up because it threw her into, all of a sudden we were looking at, is she going to end up in the ER with us?
mm,
Right. So I
mhm,
thought I had enough to just, these attachments aren't healthy. She's so peer oriented. I've got to make it stop. But it didn't work. It did not work.
right.
And so this is kind of part of my story in that, this righteousness and this
Mhm,
helper drive and actually how that has kind of, you know, been a part of my own falling from hubris.
mm,
My story, because it was years later that this is kind of an aside, but I came back around once I came to terms with what I had done to my son, where I had this fall of saying, I talked to, my sister-in-law's parents, and now she's in her 20s and she's doing really, really well, but had to apologize. I'm sorry. I crossed boundaries. I was trying to save your daughter in an
mm,
inappropriate way.
yeah.
So that was my sort of beginning crash course.
Mhm,
And so fast forward a couple months, and now I've looked forward to this time where my younger son is now going to be 6 months old. And boy, did I remember that with my first child, once he was 6 months old, he could sit by himself. He could be on the floor in the kitchen. I could cook. It's like that whole little like honeymoon phase where they're not old enough
mhm,
to walk or
mhm,
crawl, but they can
mhm,
sit. I'm
mhm,
stressed. My partner and I work opposite shifts, so it's always solo parenting.
mm,
You're in the thick of that two child or more. It's just you're just living in moment to moment. And I'm thinking, oh, once my younger son is 6 months old, I'm going to be able to get to that honeymoon phase. I'm going to be able to put him on the floor. He's going to sit, and I'm going to be able to cook a meal. Well, guess what? 6 months hit. My younger son could sit on the floor. I'd put him down, and within moments, my older son would come and throttle him to the ground, just push
mm,
him, attack. I was not prepared for this.
right.
I was not prepared for how for that attacking impulse from my older son
Mhm,
because of what was not working for him. And I was not prepared for my reaction to that.
right.
So because then I had all my own perceptions. My framework was social justice. So I'm like, this is a power dynamic. The older kid is acting with injustice. This is oppression. I was a mess. We all are, but
Mm,
I had my own
mhm,
particular mess. And this
mhm,
was, you know, how I was going to try to make sense of this attacking impulse in my older, still toddler child. And so I saw my temper flaming. I saw my reactions just, kind of being out of control themselves. And I saw again, um, how am I going to approach this? How am I going to respond? And fortunately, because I already had the in with a little bit into the Neufeld, I sought out more and I started to watch more videos about attachment. And I ended up getting into the Understanding Preschoolers course because just for anyone listening, just know Dr. Gordon Neufeld has an entire institute, multiple languages, teaching across the world. This is like an you know, internationally known approach, very little known in the United States, but internationally recognized.
And the institute is in Canada.
Yeah, but
Okay.
there's tons of there's I don't even know how many online courses they have. They have creators for therapists,
Hmm.
anybody who wants to understand children and a development and or even marriage. He's got courses on marriage. You will find like a feast of opportunity through the institute. So that was my first course. I took Understanding Preschoolers.
I'm wondering if I could pause for just a moment and backtrack a little bit to
Sure.
the awareness that you had when it came to the incident with your sister-in-law.
Oh, sure.
Just because that is something that has become very clear in my own value set as a result of this circumstance is that I don't want somebody else thinking they have to save my child. And so, like for me, that has become a very clear value. It is not my place to step in and try to save somebody else's child,
Yeah.
which can be a controversial, I
Yeah.
think, viewpoint right now, especially. Um, I mean, even among my own audience, I would imagine, that is also challenging. Anyway, I just,
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah.
yeah,
Hard
yeah,
lessons.
yes, yes, indeed, because we think we know, and everybody's out there trying to save the children. One side is trying to save the children from the other side. But both sides are doing the same thing. They're both driven by that same impulse to save the children. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So you are now seeking out more Neufeld content, the
Right.
understanding preschooler. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. 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 So that was definitely a game changer for me, taking this Understanding Preschoolers course. And there was kind of no going back after that for me because it helped me to see my son's behavior differently.
Mm,
And instead of reacting to it out of my agenda, my framework, my this whole like he's doing something bad. He's doing it on purpose.
right.
What's wrong with him?
Right.
You know,
And I
it
have
just
to fix this because this is wrong, right? And now as a mom, you feel compelled to fix it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so it just flipped that whole thing around and gave me a deeper insight, not only into um, this where these impulses were coming from, the fact that he was not mature enough to actually temper those impulses,
Hmm.
that I was actually not mature enough to temper my own impulses
Mm,
when I was
oh,
reacting to him.
yes.
And
Yeah.
so I kind of reorganized my life. And
Okay.
I instead of expecting a level of maturity from my preschooler, that was impossible. It didn't exist.
Right. Yes.
I had to reorganize myself as the more mature one, questionably mature, but um, to protect my 6-month-old from the 2-year-old and to protect the 2-year-old from me in order that, you know, that I couldn't leave my 6-month-old on the floor. So I
Hmm.
had to have my own futility
Mm-hmm.
Situation that I could not change,
Mm-hmm.
which was
Mm-hmm.
that my 2-year-old was going to attack him if he could. And if I didn't want that, I had to rearrange my life. I had to sacrifice what I wanted, which was to cook a meal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you'd been fantasizing about it.
Right. Oh,
This you
desperately.
had a vision. It was
Yeah.
going to look this way, and it was going to be
Yep.
beautiful and
Yep.
easier, and
Yep. So instead, of these play dates or these different things that I had the expectation for, it was put a mattress on the floor and let the two of them jump on it, and I'm in the room.
Mhm.
So I can get in front of the
Yeah.
frustration, 2-year-olds and my own.
I'd love to linger here a minute on the
Mhm.
expectation um, that you were able to make conscious. I think this is maybe something that is unconscious for a lot of parents, is this sort of perfect behavior expectation, a maturity expectation, that somehow we come born
Totally. Oh,
to,
it's
to
so
behave
pervasive.
perfectly and that we can just expect this of our kids. There is I notice it a lot, like my husband does it too. And I don't know that it would have been conscious for me had I maybe not been in education or had the developmental background I had about it's how unreasonable that is. We have unreasonable expectations of our children's behavior
Yep.
that we might
Exactly.
be unaware of, but that is going to drive that frustration, and take us to, like you said, this sort of immature place where we're reacting. Yeah. Okay.
Yep, totally. It was a game changer for me. And this is why I have the passion for this approach that I do, because it made such an impact on my relationship to my children. And my relationship to myself, my marriage. I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
once I started to dig in, it was like, um, oh wow, I can stop pathologizing myself too.
Hmm.
And we'll talk about this more over time, but it really was when you take that what we call the attachment-based developmental approach, or the approach of Dr. Gordon Neufeld. He moves us to stop seeing ourselves as sculptors
Right.
and move into this position of gardeners. And
Yes, I
see that
love that.
metaphor for
Yes.
human growth and development, and our responsibility towards our children.
Hmm.
We're not out there needing to shape and chisel and force, but we are cultivating the soil so that they can attach to us, which we're going to talk a lot about.
Yes.
Yes, and therefore the plant can grow. Yeah,
And, we are in adopting that approach, we are going against the mainstream expectation that we're going to be sculptors.
100%. It is so pervasive
Hmm.
in our culture
Hmm. Hmm.
and even in subcultures.
Yes.
It's so pervasive.
To the
It's so
point that we now have mothers being punished for the behavior of their children. That's how much responsibility now is on mom to sculpt.
yeah,
And
yeah,
we're talking about moms who were raised in less than ideal conditions themselves, right? Like there's
yeah,
this sort of expectation that I don't know, they think we're quite magical indeed, that we
yeah,
can, you know, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like ascend out of our own conditioning to sculpt these perfect children. You know what I mean? Like the pressure that is put on moms and parents and families is insane, especially considering the cultural conditions that we are raising our families in.
yeah.
So I just to let moms know to please have some self-compassion, you know,
Yes,
and
yes,
realistic expectations for yourself.
yes. Yes.
Hmm.
And I will say while there I don't have the same entry point as a lot of the parents who found hold on to your kids kind of already you know, in a situation where you're like, oh man, I've I'm now seeing these things that I wish I had done differently, you
Hmm.
know, had
Hmm.
known this. Um, I I just I just want to say it's like the guilt is inevitable, whether or not, you know, it's like if we are taking responsibility, then we're going to feel guilt, and we need to. And then this is something that Dr. Neufeld says I'm passionate, like I feel the same way in my story. I had to take responsibility, not only in my story with gender, but in my story with my 2-year-old and my 6-month old. I couldn't leave them to just figure it out. I had to create the conditions where they were going to be safe, compensate for their immaturity. And that act of compensating for immaturity um, at any age as parents, okay? Because it can be there at the 2-year-old, it can be there at the 20-year-old. Like my parents parented me as an immature adult up until probably like 2 years ago. So,
Okay.
and that's a
Okay.
whole other story in itself. But it's like, you know, so I just want to say the guilt is part of it. You're not alone. And there's also the need for grieving. And both of these emotions or feelings are very uncomfortable,
Hmm. Hmm.
but they are there for a reason.
Hmm.
And so I want to say that. And then I also want to say, if we can be with that vulnerability of that, what can be very painful or uncomfortable with the guilt or with the grief of what we wish we could do differently or you know what we didn't have, um, we can also I also feel like this approach of shifting from that sculptor to gardener is actually so freeing,
Hmm.
uh, because we
Hmm.
can have trust in a force that's larger than ourselves,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
that from a developmental point of view, that developmental design, that seed is coming with that design to grow. And
Yes.
our job is to do our best that we can to cultivate the conditions for growth, but ultimately it's not, we can't shape the outcome.
That's right. That's right. And isn't that so? That was my understanding of attachment. Um, Probably came a little bit later that we're born, and this is what I hear you talking about. And a lot of this is instinctual, that we as the human creature, as any life, really, right? Like we come with a sort of blueprint for how to thrive in the world, and that's what this child is being born with is there are these expectations that there are going to be certain conditions, and our job as parents, and we're wired for this as well, is to provide those conditions. And I believe this is Neufeld's stance, right? Is we know how to parent.
Yes. Yeah.
We what takes us off track is doubting that,
Mhm.
and all the how-to books out there that are really more about getting your kid to do what you want them to do and behave.
Yeah.
Right. Right. However, you know, it's more about providing the conditions. And so something else that I spend a lot of time with the Stoic mom trying to communicate though is especially when you've got older kiddos, but even moms of young kids, at some point you do have to have awareness that you are not the only influence too. There,
Yes.
there, there are other factors that are affecting those conditions in a negative way, that it is pretty much impossible in today's world to provide the ideal conditions. We
Right.
just don't live in a world that accommodates that in any way. That's another part of the grief and letting
Yeah.
go is accepting that, and letting go of control because you can't control it. You can do your best to provide the conditions, but at some point you have to, I think, make peace with the limited influence you have.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in Neufeld terminology, which we can, I
Mhm.
very much looking forward to diving into over time. We would call that facing futility.
Yes.
And
And mom and dad have to do
metaphor
it too.
and
It's
heart.
not just the kids, right? Like we
Oh,
also,
so I mean, 100 times a day,
yes.
especially, as a parent, there's so much you can't make work that you want to.
Hmm. 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 And it's painful.
Yep.
And you do
If you let yourself feel it.
exactly, exactly, which is something I think our is important in our parenting is to develop our own capacity to feel the difficult things. Otherwise, our children don't learn how to do that.
Yeah. And we
And
don't,
it will drive us to control, right? We're going to be
yeah,
more inclined to try to control things if we cannot tolerate the difficult emotions that come with parenting and love.
100%.
Mhm. Yeah.
He calls it walking the maze. It's this idea that as a parent, you're walking a maze. You're going to try different things, and sometimes you're going to hit a wall.
Mm, yeah.
You're going to hit that wall of it's either going to be, I messed up.
Yeah.
Gosh, did I have good intentions, but it just went sideways.
Hmm.
Can't tell you how many times a day I feel that way right now. Gosh,
It's called the
I
human
really
experience. Like
want
this
to
is
lose my
life.
temper today. It's like, yeah, so you hit a
Yeah.
wall or
Hmm.
you try and you do the best you've ever done and it still doesn't land with your kid. You hit that wall and it's like we need to find our tears.
Yes.
Whether it's playing a sad song,
Hmm.
watching a TV series that makes you cry at the end every time, whatever it may be, but we need to find our tears of accepting what we cannot change in order to try again the next morning.
And isn't that so opposite of what we grew up with and learned? Stop crying. I'll give you something to cry about, right? Like that's what I remember. You know, we avoid the pain and the tears. And Neufeld will say, and this is where I got the idea to connect uh, grief and acceptance to
Mm,
sort of Neufeld's idea of futility and adaptation, that grief is really linked to adaptation. Um,
100%.
and that's why grief is so important. And that's
Yeah.
why it's so important to feel the feelings. And like you said, drop into those tears of sadness.
Mhm.
That is the emotion of adaptation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful article that I can link. And I imagine this we'll come back to this. You know, we didn't really intend futility to be the topic of today's the initial conversation, more defining attachment, but that is a big piece of it, isn't it? Yeah,
Yes. It's a
yeah.
just huge and pivotal concept to understand. Yeah.
And on the other side of adaptation, though, is energy and creativity. Eh, You know, it's that you have to move through that acceptance to open up um, to possibility, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. 100%. Yep. Anybody who feels like, and maybe some listeners, I know people have a lot of different experience with crying,
Hmm. Hmm.
but if you ever feel like, wow, after those tears, just the way that you feel a freshness or a newness, a weight that's, been lifted. So, yeah, so much more to say.
I know. I want to follow this path and tell a story and um
Do it.
okay.
We'll come back around.
And I told this in my Benjamin Boyce interview, but I didn't feel like I told it very well because once you understand the process and you know what to look for, like again, once you bring consciousness to this stuff, you're playing a different game,
Yes.
right? And so I got to the point where I could watch my children in frustration
Mm,
and have a different relationship with it,
Mm,
because now I'm like, oh, this is one of those moments where
yes.
they need to learn to adapt, and in this article about futility and adaptation, he talks about how important it is. This is how we develop maturity. And so if we're avoiding any situation where we're going to, have to deal with those tears of sadness and disappointment and regret and grief, and then we are missing out on opportunities to develop our capacity for adaptation,
Mhm.
which, yeah, is so important to the human experience. Anyway, my daughter had, this is a fairly old story now from, I think, over a year ago. She still lived at home and she had planned a trip to go visit her friends in the neighboring state. And it was winter and the roads looked like they were not going to be good. Right. And so I knew before she even got up the next day that there was a good chance she'd check the weather and she was going to be grumpy. Um, and the roads were sketchy, and it was interesting because I think what she was hoping for, she was 19 at the time, is that, or maybe she was 18. She might have just been 18, um, and had her own vehicle, so she was free to go. But I think maybe was wanting us to tell her, no, you can't go on these roads. And I didn't do that. I said, how you feeling about the roads? She said, they look pretty bad. I said, yeah, she said, I can't go, huh? I said, well, that's up to you as your mom. I would hope you would really look at the road conditions and, make a safe choice. I know that safety is important to you. And so she kept looking at the roads. It was interesting to watch her shuffle through the emotions, watch her want to blame us. She got angry at us even at one point. It's again a little distant, but it was fascinating to watch that because I wasn't taking responsibility for her experience. But just to
Mm,
watch her sort of go through the different emotions, at one point she's like, let's just drive out to the freeway, and see what it looks like. And so we headed out and the roads weren't too bad. And then she hit like we were very close to the mountains, right? And once we got deep enough into the mountains and she saw the conditions of the roads, she was just like, oh, nope, I can't do this. It's not safe. And she had already cried, right? She'd already had her sadness about it, but it was so interesting to watch her shift once that acceptance hit, if that makes sense. Once she could actually give it up, she hit that wall of futility, her mood totally shifted. And she was fabulous. She's like, well, let's go get lunch. And, we ended up hanging out for the rest of the day and had a great time together. Where before, when she was looking for what to blame and who to be mad at and had to go through that anger and then again, the tears of sadness to let it go, then her mood just totally shifted. And so it was just a fascinating little uh, experience for me to be witnessing it in real time, to
oh, yeah.
witness that process of adaptation in real time and go, that's what's happening. And
Yeah.
she just built capacity. She just developed her adaptation mechanism to the next level. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is what each
How
time that offers us.
awesome is that? Gift. You're just, oh man, just like party. Let's have a party.
But instead of like trying to,
Yeah.
make her feelings wrong or try to dissuade her from the sadness. I just kept inviting her to, yeah, experience it so you can get to the other side. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Ooh. And I think, and I don't know for folks listening, I'll just say one last thing and then we can, keep going here. But you telling that story about your daughter, and I'm kind of like following, I can picture it all. And when you talk about that transition from that trying to make it work, trying to make it work, trying to make it work, and then letting it go. I identify that just internally, and you're right, bringing that awareness for me has been huge for observing my own children, but
Mhm.
also being self-aware of when I'm stuck in that anger and blame and things aren't working with my kids. It's like I do have to hit that tender point in my heart of saying, I wanted this to work. This was important
Mhm.
to me. And it's not going to. It's
I
not.
don't get what I wanted. Hmm.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
and if I hold on tight, I stay foul. I just stay so foul to them. And what is that doing to my relationship,
Hmm.
to my
Hmm.
kids?
Hmm.
Versus like finding that grief, that sadness, that sense of like I am powerless here. I'm like feeling that sadness of that. And then I can come back around and be silly.
Hmm.
And I can say, well, we're late, which I hate, but we can
Yes.
have a good time in the car.
Yes. Yes. The creativity comes back. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Instead of just being like someone who they don't want to spend time with.
Yeah. 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 And so we're talking about kids' adaptation, mom's adaptation, right? That has to happen
Ooh,
too. And
right.
the other piece of this dynamic to pay attention to is when we can't tolerate their grief and we try
Ooh,
to prevent their grief
that's huge.
because now we are preventing them from developing that adaptation mechanism.
Yeah.
But I think that happens a lot of the time where mom can't tolerate, right? It's mom that can't handle the discomfort of the child's pain. And so we try to fix that. Yeah. It's
Yeah. I'm
okay.
nodding. For your
Yeah.
listeners, I'm nodding, nodding, nodding.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 So we dove a little deeper, I think, into the
I love
mechanism
it.
maybe
I think
then.
it's great.
Yeah. Well, and so
Did you get
do
into Neufeld? Yeah.
well, it was Sears first, I was the granola mom also, and I was gonna have unmedicated births and co-slept and nursed on demand and all the Sears stuff. Um, but honestly, I was always quite inclined to be outside of the mainstream and
Mhm.
was really ready to take that all the way. Like I was on the raw milk underground and, was fantasizing about homesteading. And honestly, I kind of panicked. And my husband was less inclined, toward that lifestyle. And so that's actually when I went back to college and ended up going back to work because as you described, being a mom of those very young children, and for me, I was in my mid 30s, so I'd already had a lot of adult life, yes. And it was so uncomfortable. I just didn't even tolerate that well, how much of me it demanded and how much of me I felt I lost. And honestly, going back to school and getting a career felt easier to me. And that's why I decided to give it another go, and then next thing I know, I ended up a teacher. That was kind of accidental, but and that's where I discovered Alfie Kohn was actually as a teacher, which is surprising because it's not like his philosophy was being implemented. And for those who don't know Alfie Kohn, I think you mentioned punished by rewards, right? Um, he talks a lot about the power dynamic, which I love that you brought that up. And I think that's also important for us to talk about as we're getting into attachment. Um, but I could see what was happening to kids in the school system, that we were not gardeners, we were sculptors. And I just found that really painful,
Yeah.
and ended up leaving education and really diving into the philosophy of Alfie Kohn and more sort of unschooling approaches, right? Like really what it looked like to change that. dynamic and probably to the extreme. Um, and that is something that I would bring into this conversation too, is kind of where I like to see where frameworks overlap and where they conflict with each other. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that too. But um, and then I got recommended to read Hold On to Your Kids because I found myself with a trans-identified kiddo, thinking I was doing everything right. And now, I've got this.
Happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And reading the book and feeling the guilt and desperately wishing for a do-over, and beating myself up but then deciding to do what I could. I ended up taking one of Neufeld's parenting classes and thought it was just brilliant, but I really loved that idea that we know what to do, and if we feel like we don't know what to do, it is because we have been so divorced from our intuition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't,
Yes.
we no longer live in a quote unquote, traditional culture or a culture that supports those
Right.
intuitions.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that maybe we got some of this attachment stuff. I had a client say we kind of dropped the ball, right? There was this sort of misunderstanding, really,
Yeah.
of what
Yeah.
attachment was and what it looked like. And
Yeah.
um,
Let's talk about that a
yeah,
little bit, and then maybe we can kind of end there with
yeah.
a setup for our next conversation.
Hmm.
And I think that that is true. And so when you and I are talking about attachment, um, from the Neufeld perspective, from that model, it is different than a lot of the popular understandings of that word.
Hmm.
And so I was kind of brainstorming, what are some of the ways that that word is used in the
Hmm.
mainstream or in a popular sense. And I think, you and I've already shared one of those, which is this idea of attachment parenting, which we share that background in common, right? That Dr. Sears, like
Hmm.
We're Your Baby, nursing on demand, all of those things. So a lot in those very initial sort of newborn through 2-year-old or 3-year-old, that physical proximity, which I still to this day, cherish,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
cherish that physical closeness and proximity in those tender years. But of course, it doesn't continue past that, right? So and maybe it hits some things and misses the point on others. But
And it's challenging and not even
oh
doable for lots of
yes,
families, you
totally,
know. Hmm.
totally.
And there's grief in that too, you know.
Oh yes,
Yes.
yes. Thank you for saying that.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that's kind of one of our popular understands is like this idea of baby bonding, popularized at least in the United States by Dr. Sears and some others. I think another, maybe a more negative perspective on attachment that I inherited, I'll just speak for myself, was, dabbling in meditation and Buddhism at different points in my adult years, and this idea of letting go of attachments.
Hmm.
We should
Hmm.
not feel attached, So I think I came into, part of why Neufeld blew my mind is that I had had such a negative connotation
Mm.
around the word, right? I didn't understand it, but it was definitely like I should not. And you're going to hear that as much as I tell any parts of my personality or my story. I mean, my inner judge is like, "Whoo, baby."
Mm.
So,
Welcome to the club, right?
should not have attachment.
Mm.
It's bad. You
Well, and
know,
that's black and white
oh,
approach to things. Yeah.
which is a trait of immaturity and in some
Yes.
way the purity of emotion.
Yes.
Is what
Yes.
Neufeld would speak to in a sense, like,
Hmm. Hmm.
but
And there's still value in that non-attachment worldview that I do think is relevant. It's going to be relevant to the conversation as we continue to explore what relational attachment I guess, if we might call it that, is. Yeah.
Right, pulling some of those threads apart. Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then another piece that I think has kind of made its way into popular culture is this. I think there was a book that talked about attachment styles. I know some of my friends who, when I was kind of first really into
Hmm.
the preschoolers course and things like that years ago, I wanted to tell everybody about attachment. I just wanted to tell everybody in my life, and some of my friends were like, oh, what? Most of my friends were like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about.
Hmm.
But then this book came out and became a little more popularized, at least in some of my friends' circles, that was about these attachment styles. So then it was, are you a secure attacher, an insecure attacher, an avoidant attacher? And a lot of it was around dating, if
Well,
you
and
want
I
to.
think, yes, that this is kind of the crux of it, of what we know of attachment theory right now. And I could be mistaken, but I believe it's rooted in the work of Bowlby and Ainsworth, if I've got the
Those are
names.
two, definitely. I have not
Um,
studied them, but I hear that them being part of the some pieces to the puzzle.
yes, and that is often used in like relationship coaching and marriage counseling, right? Are
Yep.
these ideas of attachment styles? Uh-huh.
Yep.
Because they will impact the types of relationships, the way we show up in relationships and relational dynamics. Yes.
Mhm.
But that
Um,
is not what we're talking about when we're talking about the Neufeld approach, or like were you going to
right.
distinguish kind of between that and
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else that you wanted to speak to first, though, in terms of other more popular understands, like when that word gets thrown around, the
Hmm.
ways people might interpret it?
No, I think just again that idea. I know I've had moms who kind of bristle a little bit around attachment parenting. And I think because, again, we all have those unique circumstances
Oh
when our
yeah.
children are really young that can prevent us from providing the conditions we'd like to provide, or maybe there's just all so many things that can play into what our families look like when our children are really, really young.
Yes.
And I just want to encourage lots of self-compassion because
100%. And there are so many, if you didn't co-sleep or breastfeed, doesn't mean your child isn't attached to you. You'd like there, that's not at all the case. And I think that's a good reason to say, okay, well, this is how we hear about it in the popular
Mhm.
culture and the mainstream.
Mhm.
Let's see it a little from a slightly different perspective and a little deeper view. And
So maybe
so,
look at it developmentally. Yeah, I mean,
totally.
okay. Yeah.
So, so, this is sort of a teaser for what's yet to come and the
Hmm.
conversations that follow, which I'm so excited
I know,
about.
me too.
And this has already been so rich.
And fun.
Yes, yes. But in the conversations let's say when I use this term attachment, what I am going to be referring to is what, Dr. Gordon Neufeld would define as the drive or the relationship that's characterized by a pursuit and preservation of proximity. Well, what does that mean? It is an instinctual drive, and it is an instinctual drive to pursue closeness
Mm.
and preserve closeness.
Hmm.
Okay. And I love the way he talks about it because I'm like a forest and trees thinker. And this whole
Mm.
model is like full of forest and trees for me. But he really takes it to think about gravity.
Yes. Yes. I
Think
remember this in the
of
course
Earth's
at.
Earth. Think
Hmm.
about the planets orbiting the sun. There is a whole of togetherness,
Hmm.
of attach, to connect. Even matter is made up of particles that are attached to one another. So it is from this perspective, it is kind of a preeminent force that holds reality together. I mean, for me, it's like, wow, how much more profound could you get than that?
Absolutely. Well, and if I could even like extend on the profundity there, the word matter is related to mother,
Whoa.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's this all relates back to like the mother archetype and what life is born from and what, yes, as you said, what holds us together.
Yeah. And when we say matter, not just like in a physics sense, but another layer of the profundity is that as we get in later sessions into this developmental model of attachment, the drive to matter to someone, to
Ugh,
be significant, to be valued is one
yes.
of those stages. And it is the beginning of the more vulnerable stages of
Mm,
attachment from this developmental perspective.
mm,
And so that kind of takes me to that. So another just, very drop of water that, could reflect the ocean of this definition
mm-hmm,
is that we're going to be looking at attachment from a developmental approach. And what does that mean? It means that it isn't just a point in time. It's not a static style. We talk about those styles that you
mm-hmm,
can just say, I am this.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
it is a process. And it is a process that in itself is developmental. In other words, that it unfolds or it can get stuck. And it is also key to our maturation. So in and of itself, it's something that has to unfold. We're not born already with attachment. It has to develop over time.
Mm,
And it is that development is also key to our own process of maturation. And I think maybe I'll just say one more thing and leave it here. The analogy that Dr. Neufeld uses that I think is so helps to give a clear picture is this idea of a plant. And that in order for what we see of the plant, which is the growth, right? The stem, the branches, the leaves, hopefully the fruit, of whatever that may
mm-hmm,
be, whatever kind of plant it may be, whatever kind of fruit it brings. Um, we see the growth, but what's underneath the soil are the roots. And the deeper that those roots reach, and I'm sure if there's a botanist here, they're like, well, many roots, maybe there's different root structures, but it's, the farther that those roots can reach
mm-hmm.
for connection, um, the more energy is then going to be able to be given for that growth. But it's because it's under the ground, we don't always see it. We can't see it. So we have to bring our awareness to it. Um, and yeah, so to the unfolding.
Yeah, yeah. And my followers know how into Jung I am right now, Carl Jung and Jungian philosophy. And he also talks about us each being born as an acorn with the blueprint.
Yeah, the
Hmm.
blueprint. Hmm.
But it is instinctually, we are driven to grow and mature into what is intended, right, in that seed.
Yep.
Yes, yes. And that the more that root system is developed, the stronger and more solid that life
Yeah.
is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's through relationship.
I had an idea for a title as you were talking. What do you think of attachment matters?
Yeah, I love it.
Okay.
I love it.
Thank you for listening. We hope you take something of value from our conversation today. Please check out the show notes for additional resources, including a prompt for reflection. We welcome your feedback in the comments and hope you join us for the next episode of Attachment Matters.